Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. People of America! In a few days, you'll be asked to choose which of two frickin' lunatics to elect to the White House and to select a handful of jackasses to the Senate. Yes, the bread and circuses must go on, people. So you don't notice that the Vomitorium on Wall Street is filled to the brim with the spew of bankers gorging on your wealth and of brokers having sordid orgies with your retirement funds. Wake up! Or go back to sleep, you sheep. Stacy?
Well, Max, indeed. First, we'll show the two candidates that are up in a few days for this election of 2012. Here's an image from William Bonsai 7, Salvador Det Bama. As you see, that's a deficit surrealist. Looking pretty scary there, Obama.
Nice, nice. Get Dolly in the show.
And the other is the GOP cuckoo nest. As you see there, Mitt Romney with his vice presidential candidate, Paul Ryan, and behind them are John McCain, George Bush 1 and 2.
Who plays Nurse Ratched?
I think maybe Blythe Masters.
Oh yeah, Blythe Masters would make an excellent Nurse Ratched. More credit default swaps. Credit default swaps. Juicy fruit, juicy fruit, juicy fruit. Here's Johnny. I'm having a Stanley Kubrick flashback.
Well, Max, aside from Stanley Kubrick, okay, we have an end of empire sort of election going on. None of the real issues are mentioned. It's just literally bread and circuses, wacky stuff. I was going to say a four-letter word there going on. And they're just deciding on all sorts of bizarre social issues. And it gets worse and worse. Every election they do this. But here we are in the middle of a Great Depression, and not once has the Great Depression been mentioned. It's all about various other things. So let's look at this first headline. Back from the Vomitorium, the looting of the mortgage settlement agreement. Now, this was the big deal that Obama started the year with. Remember, he settled with the big major banks in America for $25 billion. Of that, $2.5 billion went to the states. And apparently the states are looting the mortgage settlement fund, and the odds are good that you or someone you know is getting robbed for the second time.
Yeah, that's right. So, in economics, they talk about a transmission problem. The Fed is lowering rates. It's not filtering through the economy, and we see the stagnation of the credit markets where, Obama is just an outright thief. And it's just a frickin' crime.
Well, he helped cover up this crime. The money has been transferred to the states. It's up to the governors and the state legislators, the senators, the congresspeople for the various states to do what they're supposed to do. They've decided that they're going to plug the holes in their own budget deficits instead with this money, do nothing to help the homeowners. And so, according to recent reports, politicians, not bankers, are the culprits this time around, siphoning billions from that historic settlement and pumping it into their broken state budgets. Instead of manning up and changing their diet, they're taking a cue from ancient Rome. After a quick trip to the Vomitorium, is back to the banquet table. Care for a mint?
Well, I hope he wins this election, Obama. If he doesn't, watch for him running out the White House with a TV.
Well, that's the role, really, of our Congress, our Senate, our White House. Bill Clinton, I believe, did that. The last guy who lost.
Yeah, no, that's the blue dress, wasn't it? They kept that for posterity's sake. But no, if they lose the White House, all these Congress people and White House folks are going to be running out the back door. TV, toasters, electric wave ovens, whatever they can get their hands on. A portrait of George Washington, they'll be running down the street. Woohoo!
So again, Max, the banksters are making money at every step of this fraud path. We talked about this at the time that Barack Obama's agreement with these banks for $25 billion was just a cover-up. So we go back to the election, Max. Before the election was over, Wall Street won. Now, this is from Nomi Prinz. I know you're talking to her in the second half of the show. And she breaks down all of how the banksters are winning, whatever candidate wins this election, that they've already bought both sides of the aisle, of course, but all the rhetoric, the very marginal, the few times that they've even mentioned the banking crisis, it's all fake. That one side pretends like, we've introduced so much regulation, the best regulation, the strongest regulation since Glass-Steagall, since the Great Depression, where Barack Obama, I'm not a zombie, I help fight for the people. Well, Mitt Romney says the same thing, that he's going to get rid of the regulation in order to protect the people.
Yeah, well, no, it's heads I win, tails you lose, right? I mean, that's the game that they play, and they never lose. It's like when these banks report that they had 60, 70, 80, 90 straight days of gains on their proprietary trading accounts. It's like, flipping heads 90 times in a row. Statistically, virtually impossible. But yet they get away with it. They front-run trades, they manipulate markets, they high-frequency trade loot, they compromise the political system, they trade on inside information between Washington and Wall Street, they print money when it's convenient, they throw people out of their homes, they encourage the prison industrial complex and put people in jail with deals with the states that guarantee 98% occupancy for the prisons, therefore inducing the unlawful incarceration of millions of Americans for the benefit of the private equity groups and corporations like Corrections Corps of America on behalf of a philosophical agenda which many call market fundamentalism.
Max, it's an end of empire. They've got their jackasses in the Senate and their lunatic in the White House. It's the same thing that happened in Rome. Let's move back to the Vomitorium. Let's talk about what Nomi Prinz here is saying about zero interest rate policy. This is part of the collusion, the racket. Whatever team wins is going to continue with the zero interest rate policy because this is what the banks want. This is what Jamie Dimon wants. This is what Lloyd Blankfein wants. This is what Brian Moynihan wants. So she, in particular, talks about zero interest rate policy. This is a big issue for you. You've had a big issue against this policy, against the savers, in order to appease the speculators. So between 2005 and 2007, U.S. commercial banks held approximately $6.97 trillion of interest-bearing customer deposits. During the past 2 quarters, they held an average of $7.31 trillion. During the first period, when Fed funds rate averaged 4.5%, banks paid their customers an average of $39.6 billion of interest per quarter. More recently, with ZIRP, they paid an average of $8.9 billion in interest per quarter, or nearly 77% less. In dollar terms, Max, that's $30.7 billion per quarter that banks in America are paying less per interest per quarter, or $123 billion per year.
All right, they stole $123 billion and counting in America, all over the world.
Well, it's called wealth redistribution, and all of these crazy lunatic audience members in the Coliseum of America, that is the American populace, it's like up, down, down, up, up, up. Oh, that guy's bad, that guy's a socialist, that guy's a Marxist, that guy's a communist, that guy's Stalin, that guy's Mao. Well, none of them mentioned that it was redistribution to the banksters, that the bankers, the top 0.00001%, were having this wealth transferred to them. It was all about the people on food stamps, the 50, 60, 70 million Americans on food stamps.
But redistribution implies methodology, which is to apply some kind of schematic paradigm, deep modeling of the looter and the thief. In other words, you shouldn't call it redistribution because it sounds as though there's some economic theory involved. It's just stealing.
So let's look at how much in total has been stolen since this financial crisis began. Since ZIRP kicked into gear in 2008, banks have saved nearly $486 billion in interest payments, while average salary and compensation increased by 23% and dividend payments declined by 14.05%. Again, look at this racket. Look how the shift in wealth. And everybody this was never mentioned in any of the debates. It was everybody's shocked, like, why is America becoming so unequal? Why is this wealth and income gap growing? It's right there.
Well, look, the 0% interest rates pursued by Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, when he goes to Congress and testifies why he's doing this, he says, well, we have to keep on guard for deflation, and we don't see much inflation in the system. Well, over the past 20 years, they've changed the definition of inflation at least twice. They don't include food and energy. If they calculated inflation as they did 20 years ago, the inflation rate, including energy and food, would be running at 9%, which is very, very high. And Bernanke, if he was responsible and he was looking at numbers in a responsible way, would have already started raising rates. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago to head off this inflation. But no, he's engaged in quantitative easing, and he's engaged in artificially low interest rates, which are creating, amongst other things, the so-called fiscal cliff. That's completely fabricated and invented by Bernanke's irresponsibility at the Federal Reserve Bank. He's created 100 million people around the world, him and his fellow central bankers, being thrust back into poverty, as Paul Moore, top regulator at HBOS, said on this very show. So this is a complete and utter 360-degree cluster F.
With this ZERP, the banks have gained $500 billion since the crisis began, since rates went to zero. So, but the final one, the biggest bank of all, JP Morgan, I've got my protection to, if I have to mention them, I need protection, my silver protection, right? The biggest banks are the biggest takers in this ZERP policy. Consider JP Morgan Chase's cut. Although its deposits disproportionately increased by 46% since 2007, i.e. pre-ZERP, and most of this, Max, is due to their acquisition of Washington Mutual, its interest expenses declined by nearly 89%, while their deposits increased by 46%. So from 2004 to 2007, Chase paid out $34.4 billion in interest to its deposit customers. From 2008 to mid-2012, it paid out $3.4 billion. JP Morgan Chase's ratio of interest paid to deposit of 0.27% is the lowest of the big four banks that on average pay less than smaller banks anyway. So there you have, these are numbers assigned to how much has been stolen. This was never addressed in any of the debates by either of the candidates. You know, there are only two that you're allowed to vote for. And so here we have a situation of end of empire where we have vomitoriums on Wall Street.
Oh, I got my Jamie Dimon voodoo doll right here. Available at your local voodoo emporium. It's got all you need to inflict massive voodoo pain on this possessed devil of finance on Wall Street. And you can attack the voodoo doll in various locations. Here it's caused serious genital discomfort. So we'll try it there. Oh, Jamie! That's gotta hurt, buddy. Let's try it again, one for each gonad. There you go, buddy. That's the world speaking to you. You can feel it down there in your loins because people hate you. They hate you with a vengeance. When they see you, they want to vomit on your face because you stole hundreds of billions of dollars. You're a crook and a larcenistic pig. Where else can we hit him? How about right here in the head? Ah! Right here in your Blythe Masters inspired brain cells. Oh, there you go, Jamie. How do you feel that? Ah, Jamie Dimon. Okay, where else? You keep pointing to something. What are you pointing to?
Go to hell.
Fair enough. There he goes. Okay, Jamie Dimon, see you in hell. They've got a special room. What else?
Chronic flatulence.
Oh, well, that's nothing new there. He's already got chronic flatulence. Everyone who works at JP Morgan knows that Jamie Dimon can't go 5 yards without... You know, that's one of the social faux pas, unfortunately. They like to hire the sulfur-smelling, devil-worshipping Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein to run these banks. So they get, it's like a, you know, pre-step to hell. You know, and then they go to hell, then it's some more 24/7 flatulence in their face. It's all 24/7 down there for Jamie. All right, Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way. So... Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Los Angeles to talk with Nomi Prinz, author of It Takes a Pillage and Black Tuesday. Nomi is a former senior bank executive at both Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns. Nomi, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. Thank you.
All right, Nomi, your latest blog post is titled, Before the Elections Were Over, Wall Street Won. Explain.
Yeah, well, that's right. The point of the article was to amalgamate all of the information that doesn't get discussed in the mainstream media about how these candidates are actually the same with respect to, well, many things. But what the point of my article was with respect to how they deal with Wall Street, financial regulation, banks continuing to be too big to fail, and et cetera. And that the minor difference between them is just how they verbalize their acceptance of Wall Street. Obama verbalizes his acceptance by saying that he has passed the most sweeping reform ever since the Great Depression, which isn't true. And Romney verbalizes his acceptance of Wall Street by saying he will repeal it. However, being as the legislation in question, the Dodd-Frank Act, is completely meaningless with respect to reforming Wall Street, they are both the same. And then I go on in terms of the detail as to how that act actually looks, how it doesn't affect anything, and then how the SEC is complicit, how the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the United States, is complicit, and how the Federal Reserve has been complicit in providing zero interest rate policy, which is negative for everybody except Wall Street, and go into greater detail with all of those aspects.
Yeah, there's a great extension of the fraud into the virtual markets and gaming markets, because we see that InTrade, which is the Irish stock market, virtual stock market, where you can buy and sell both Obama and Romney, has now been involved in a manipulation scandal from the operatives in the Romney campaign, who have manipulated the price of his contract higher because they know that in America the media would then report on a higher price as somehow indicative of momentum, which then is played in amongst the general population of voters who are getting screwed by these Wall Street monstrosities, Romney and Obama, and being fed by another derivative of Wall Street, a prediction market on InTrade, all helped along by the mainstream media, as you mentioned. The mainstream media is shameless, isn't it, Nomi? There's nothing in America, really, the New York Times or the LA Times, or nothing on TV that really delves into the fact that the electoral process now in America is a complete and utter sham, correct?
Well, it's as fraudulent as the money behind it. And as you say, that the main additional aspect that we have today in the elections is that we can, there's this gaming aspect. So even the elections are financialized along the lines of tradability and contracts and manipulation. The media has continued to assume that Americans are so stupid that they cannot look at delineations in these candidates. They have to be in either pro-Obama or pro-Romney, and that is how all of the television, all of the newspapers have been positioning this election, as if there's a tremendous difference between the two. And it goes further than that. So that if anyone has an opinion outside of those two camps, it's as if it's somehow unpatriotic and un-American to even point out the fact that both of these people are really the same. And if you go back historically and look at all the various elections, there's been a sameness amongst the main two parties for decades, but it's never been as bad as it is now. There's never been a candidate, Obama, which has been so supported by Wall Street to the extent that his Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, who was one of the main architects for the bailout and subsidization, the current subsidization that goes on of the Wall Street banks right now, is completely not even covered at all in this election. It's amazing to me that the Treasury Secretary of the United States is not even getting the remotest amount of play in this election when the economy is supposed to be the prevalent subject. And the reason for that is because he is complicit in keeping Wall Street where it is and keeping individuals where they are, which is in two separate camps. And Romney, I honestly don't think he has a clue as to the ins and outs of regulation, of Fed policy, really anything, but it doesn't matter from his perspective because he's just continuing the general sort of Republican vein of we're just going to get rid of it if it looks like regulation. Whether it is or not, it doesn't really matter. And Wall Street has lined up this election to support Romney. But I don't think that's because he's Republican and Obama's Democrat. They supported Obama fine last time. I think it's because Romney looks to them like he's going to win, and they like to back a winner.
Now, Nomi, early in the program, we went over the cost of ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, to the U.S. citizen. Elaborate on zero interest rate policy. Most people will perhaps think zero interest rates help them rather than harm them.
Well, zero interest rate policy is what we've had since the end of 2008, basically, when the Fed stepped in. And in addition to lavishing many means for lending to the banking community in return for assets that the banks want to get off their books because they can't sell them and they're taking up space and they aren't very good, decided to say, all right, well, if there's zero interest rate policy, it means there'll be liquidity, there'll be money in the system that'll be very cheap, and the banks will supposedly take this money, lend to the general population, lend to small businesses, lend to even businesses that are creating infrastructure, doing anything productive, etc. And this was the philosophy that the Fed pushed as to the reason why they would have zero interest rates. It would benefit everyone. As we know, it has benefited only the big banks. Why is that? Because they're not lending like they said they were going to. Well, they never said they were going to. They're not lending like the Fed said they were going to. They're not lending like the Treasury Department said they were going to. We've now had almost 4 years of this policy. It is the longest time we have had rates this low in the history of the country, and it hasn't helped with creation or growth. It has helped with what I call the illusion of stabilizing the banking system. But how does it cost Americans? How does it cost people here? Well, what happens is even people who have money to save, which is a declining component of the population, they deposit this money in banks, and they're getting nothing in return. They're getting close to 0%. The average interest rate that banks are paying for the right to use the deposits of the American population is a quarter a year. 0.25 of 1% per year for deposits, which is basically zero.
Right. Well, additionally, the insurance industry is now complaining that the multi-year program of zero interest rate policy has destroyed their business model because they rely on normalized interest rates to pad their accounts so that they can pay out during catastrophes and accidents and other insurance products. Like, for example, the huge storm in New York is a huge insurance event, but these insurance companies, because of the 0% interest rate policies, are saying we're going to go bankrupt. So that belies the idea that America is based on the idea of private property, because if there's no insurance, then there is no private property, and then there is no capitalism, as that term is understood in the United States. Nomi Prinz, you wrote Black Tuesday, which is a novelization, if you will, on events surrounding the crash and depression in the late 20s and early 30s. And a couple of questions about that. First of all, the Wall Street tells us that the crash was not caused by financial speculation to begin with. And then they go on to say that the recovery had nothing to do with financial reforms brought in like Glass-Steagall or the Securities Act of 33 or 34. But in my view, and I've worked on Wall Street myself for many years, it seems like the crash was caused by financial speculation in the 20s, very similar to what we saw before this recent crash and during this recent crash. And the thing that's missing from the current era is that there is no reform. Your thoughts?
That's exactly right. The crash of 1929, despite what economists and some historians have said since that period, was definitely caused by speculation. Not only that, when you look at the records of the investigation and the Pecora Commission that was investigating the crimes, the frauds of these banks going into the crash in 1929, they were the equivalent of emails, but they were telexes and telegrams that were going back and forth between bankers and some of their investors, talking about how some of these trusts that were being created for railroads, for oil companies, for other types of industry coming into play were very, very shaky. There was a lot of information that came out in those investigations, if anyone were to care to look at it, where the Latin American countries, which was a big part of the fraud that doesn't get discussed historically, Peru and Chile and Argentina, were used by the bankers to increase their own deposits and to make money on the securities that they issue to investors, and those collapsed into the crash in 1929. The real estate market collapsed in 1927. Ford stopped creating cars because there wasn't enough demand in 1928. But you had a stock market that was riding high because a lot of bankers were involved with a lot of media, and the president at the time, President Coolidge, and the Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who were really, really big cheerleaders for Wall Street and for speculation. And as a result, there was a lot of illusion into that crash. So the crash was definitely caused by speculation. And what happened afterwards, yes, there was reform. There was a distinction and a separation between the types of banks that could take deposits and could deal with the population's money, and the ones that could trade and speculate and create trust and lie and manipulate the media and stuff toxic crap onto the population. And the banks themselves, and this is something that doesn't come up in history books, it's very fascinating. I'm looking into it for my current research on my new book. The bankers themselves, the head of Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, it was just Chase, not Chase Manhattan at the time, Winthrop Aldrich, very rich man, part of the Rockefeller installation, all of that. He was the #1 proponent of Glass And the reason that Winthrop Aldrich was so pushing for that was because he truly believed that the instability in the banking system was going to create greater instability for the country. And he truly believed that to separate the ability to speculate from the ability to deal with depositors was important for the sheer health of the United States. And FDR at the time was the president, and he pushed that through. But with the help of these bankers, this would never happen today, and that's the major difference. And that's the major sadness in where we are today as a country, that there's not only no for history and how it really went down, which was collaboratively, and what's going on now, which is like a collaborative opposite direction where we continue to pretend that everything's fine, that the Frank-Dodd Act means anything.
All right, Naomi, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much, Matt.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Naomi Prinz. Look for her current and new books. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.